Welcome to Sabbath Collective, a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of Scripture. We'll begin our time with the lighting of the Shabbos candles. And traditionally, the mothers of the home light the candles, which represent the lights of peace and love and joy and unity. And then she encircles the candles with her hands 3 times, which is a gesture that welcomes in the Sabbath. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who gives us rest. Well, tonight we're going to get into something really needed, I think, and really necessary. Yes, Derek, it was indeed. Good to see everybody tonight. So tonight we're going to look at the alternative to war. Now, the U.S. is big, as we all know, on fighting wars. There's a war on cancer, war on drugs, war on fake news, war on a virus. Then there are the human wars, and they involve people at war with other people. War targets an enemy using whatever means necessary. And everything in the war, most especially the images and language, has become weaponized, as we all are very familiar. Hey, Evelyn, great to see you, honey. Shabbat Shalom. Robert Myers, who's a professor of anthropology and public health at Alfred University, uses this phrase. He says, the Warspeak permeating everyday language puts us all in the trenches. Isn't that just a fantastic and very true quote? Warspeak is what he calls it. Law professors Oren Gross and Fianwala Eolaine, I know I'm butchering that name, published about how the framing of issues in a war can, and I'm quoting them, significantly shape choices. Meaning people are much quicker in a rush to judgment and quicker to act out in extremes when they think it's a war. Politicians know this, media outlets know this, businesses know this, and unfortunately even Western evangelical leaders know this, which is why all of them use the framework of war to stoke fear, to incite, to rally, and to create loyalty. Pew Research says this war language is, I'm quoting, a defining feature of American politics today. We are all surrounded by war language. And we all pretty much are in PTSD right about now. So we've been in Sabbath Collective. Hey, Catherine, good to see you. Shabbat Shalom. Talking throughout the past few weeks, actually, about the design of our brains, how the Lord created our brains to function. And living in a state of war disengages our empathy, our creativity, our openness to even hearing God, our learning, our healing, physical and emotional, and it engages our fight and or flight responses. Now, we've become heightened in our awareness because of this of everything that can possibly go wrong, which is exactly how we're designed, right? So we're in this state, our eyes and our minds just focus on everything that can possibly go wrong, which means we see life as a series of potential dangerous threats. Now, again, this is the design of God to save our lives. However, we are not designed to live in a state of chronic battle. And I would posit that many of us are feeling a bit deadened to everything because we are living in this way. Our mental, spiritual, physical, social health is actually compromised because we're living in chronic war. Now, 2 interesting things to look at. One is from The Art of War, and it says the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Okay, and again, that's from The Art of War. And Kohelet, the writer of Ecclesiastes, writes in chapter 3, don't waste your energy fighting the opposition. Don't waste your energy fighting the opposition. Interesting. I was speaking with a man a couple years ago who was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's. And as we were having a discussion about it, he told me this, and I'll never forget the phrase he used. He said, "My broken brain will not win in this war." So, what he's saying with that phrase is that he's literally at war with his misfunctioning brain. But the problem with that is his brain is part of him. There's been a lot of research on the negativity of the phrase that we use very often, battling cancer. And that research was done on those with cancer. And the fact that people all the time tell them, fight the battle, don't give up the fight. And all that psychologically goes along with that. Now, for some people with cancer, this may be the exact motivation they need. It's really whatever works. But for others, this is sort of imposed on them, or they think it's the way they should relate to it. And what we found is it's exhausting to them. It's depleting and it's condemning. And they always refer to how they're always kind of gauging how hard and how much they're fighting. Oftentimes, those war weapons we use on the cancer cells also kill more than the cancer cells. Now, these protocols are changing recently, but up until a few years ago, it was the rule of thumb, just throw nuclear bombs at the cancer cell and any collateral damage is acceptable. And that's the way we think. We declared a war on bacteria several decades ago, and we wash everything to death. And now we realize, that's not so good. We try to fix predator fish in lakes by using other predator fish. Hello, you can see the problem there. We try to remove pests from crops by using systems and products that poison our own gut biome and the biome of the earth. See, this is a pattern. And this lifestyle of war on things that we don't want or we don't understand isn't sustainable. Now, let me qualify. We have serious problems in our environment, in our bodies, in our society. But oftentimes when these things are actually supported and strengthened instead of attacked by design, they often heal themselves. They simply need support, not war. Autophagy is a term that we really read a lot today, and it's the term that happens inside of our bodies when our body actually eats the bad inside of it. Autophagy means self-eating. Autophagy happens in a healthy environment. And this is how we're designed. Now, again, I'm not saying that man-made inventions or interventions are bad. Certainly, when you think about a lot of different illnesses, this is a very viable choice. As soon as I qualify to get my immunization for COVID-19, I'm in line, okay? Certainly there are drugs and protocols that save lives. But I'm more talking about a mindset of destructive war versus a mindset of building up the health. A focus on life rather than death. A focus on strengthening the good rather than killing the bad, if you're with me. Jim is saying, I think that's a huge part to emphasize. For some, that's what works. Absolutely. Absolutely. And whatever works is, if it works for you, it's good for you. It's right for you. We never want to impose a one way is the only way onto others. And Alexandra, we are not designed to live in a state of chronic battle. Absolutely. Hey, Parika, great to see you, honey. Shabbat Shalom. Hey, Neets, good to see you in Taiwan. And love to my grandbaby, if she's watching. Nai loves you, Lahava. Alexandra, they simply need support, not war. Yes, absolutely. Let me give you an example of this. I lived and worked, as most of you know, at a ministry in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And in about the year 1990, we got a great idea. We were in a very high crime area with a lot of drug dealers and, really dangerous stuff going on, right? And people that live there would call the police, and the police, I'm not lying to you. The police would tell us, call us when it's over, and we'll come and pick up the bodies. That's the true story. So starting with the lot, again, we were trying to change the block that we lived in and the block that our church was in first. Like, let's try some things, see how they work. Starting with one of the lots that was vacant on our block, that was filled with trash and stripped car parts, we decided, let's clean this out and make it into a garden and a playground. And so we did. And then we put bright lights on this lot. And the kids were playing during the day, and we also gave away food there so that the people would feel protective over it. So we had a storage area where we had a lot of grocery stores give us leftover food, and we would give it out at this lot as well. And so the drug dealers that would hang out at this lot before, because it was dark and it was shady and they could hide behind things and all that, and no one would go into it, they started to feel uncomfortable. And so they moved to kind of the periphery. And then ultimately, they ended up leaving. Now, we did that actually in several lots around the area. We didn't war with what we wanted out. We did good. And the good, the healthy, is what created an environment where that which wasn't healthy for the neighborhood didn't feel comfortable staying. They could either join the good stuff that we were doing at the church, or they could leave. And actually, some of them did join. See, in these human issues we are facing today, half of the country thinks the other half is enemies. And those enemies need to be taken out. And this means we're all of us, living in a chronic state of war. And our enemies can be people all around us. In fact, we may not even know who they are. We'll be in a conversation with somebody will make some kind of racist statement, and bam, now there's an enemy, and we're on high alert, right? Now, let me qualify that all of this. That's not to say that there is not a time for war. There is. And that's not to say that the people who are looking at very important issues in our world right now as a life or death war for them are doing the wrong thing. Again, as Jim pointed out, what's right for you is good for you. I'm not suggesting you or I should never be at war when there are clearly times we should. But what I'm challenging is the state of constant war. And also to present a thought that sometimes war can be avoided and the objectives can still be reached. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through, Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 3 and 7 through 8 says, "For everything there is a season, a right time for every intention under heaven." I'm sorry, I put the wrong card. I was right all along. Let's start again. Okay. Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 3 and 7 and 8. "For everything there is a season, a right time for everything, every intention under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die." You all know this text. "A time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." And of course, we know this is life. There's seasons, there's flows, and we need to know what season we're in for us. So, yes, there's a time for war. But again, I question living in a state of chronic war if you can be healthy in that place. So, what is the alternative to war in a culture of war that we're living in right now? Because, make no mistake about it, we're living in a culture of war. Well, in the Hebraic writings, there's an understanding of the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. And most of you have heard me speak of this before. So we are designed by Yahweh with, as Jewish sages call them, a Yetzer Tov, which means good inclination, and a Yetzer Hara, which means evil inclination. Now, why are we created with a good inclination and an evil inclination? Why? Well, sages believe the Yetzer Hara is actually for our good. It challenges our convictions. It creates strength in us. I've talked about the term hormesis, which is a term that we've been looking at, and it's from an irritation that happens in everything from plants to our bodies that challenge the plant or the body, and what comes out of that is good. And I always use the example, because we all know about this, like grapevines in a drought. Grapevines in a drought make the best wine because they're challenged. Challenge to the mind, the body, and the spirit makes us healthy. And rabbinic scholars say things that may be defined as the Yetzer Hara, like maybe this spirit of competition or a really powerful sex drive, they actually say that these things can be harnessed for good. These kinds of tensions are, as Nachmanides says, for the purpose of allowing people to reach their full potential. So, in other words, there is beauty in the strength that can be seen in looking at things, not always as a battle to win, but as a tension to manage, which we've talked about this a couple years ago. Interesting, right? So the moon doesn't come to dispel the darkness, but to reveal the beauty in the darkness. And again, we oftentimes are so fearful about being challenged, about being discomfort, about darkness, and we want the light, and we talk about this. But the moon is actually designed by God to reveal the beauty in the darkness. It reflects in order to do that. War is not always the way. Let me see what, Derek is saying my favorite scripture. I know, mine too, Derek. Barika says, isn't that something from the 90s church culture was about warring? Yes, Barika, absolutely. This is very much into the evangelical mindset, this warring. Constantly warring, at war with evil, and this passion to define good and evil very quickly. Destroying rather than working. Absolutely, Barika. Totally co-sign. Post 9/11, exactly. Even more. Even heightened even more. Yes. I think I missed Tara's comment. Barika was, Jesus our healer, Tara is saying, taught to live in peace and seek it even when the circumstances may be difficult. Absolutely. Barika's mom, good point. War is not always the way, but sometimes neither is the middle ground. And there's a lot of talk about middle ground now. I am not talking tonight about some kind of fake peace. Shut up and play nice. There is no middle ground between disinformation and information. No middle ground between racism and justice. No middle ground, literally, between life and death. Now, let me give you a very real example. Sex trafficking is very heavy around sporting events, right? And in Tampa, we just hosted, where I live, we just hosted Super Bowl week. And we had over 75 arrested who were responsible for sex trafficking using a massive undercover operation. Is it okay to meet in the middle of this issue and say, well, you imprison women, but you didn't beat them, so maybe you're okay? I've even heard people justify this by saying, but their own families sold them so that they could eat, so maybe it's a good thing. Never. Sex slavery is wrong on every level. There is no middle ground, right? So if there's no middle ground with the things that you are passionate about, and there is an extreme agenda that is the opposite of what you believe, how do you not turn that into living in a chronic war? Because that's really the question, right? Let's look at a mashal, a parable of Yeshua. A mashal is a story. It's the Hebrew word for parable. A mashal is an anecdote told to illuminate something unknown and unfamiliar by the use of using something that is known and familiar. And it lays them side by side so that you can see the contrast and the comparison and you can learn from it. So Yeshua uses them often, as most Hebraic writers did, and he lays these things side by side. And Yeshua tells a parable that really relates to us in this time. Hey, Evangelina, good to see you. Shabbat Shalom. Rebecca says there was definitely a big emphasis in spiritual warfare. Huge emphasis. I lived through that. I remember very clearly. And it really gave us a very unhealthy takeaway with that. And that's not to say that there's not spiritual warfare going on. But again, it's that big Greek either or thinking that kind of blew the whole thing up. And then people lived in a chronic state of defining what is evil and what is good all the time, right? So Yeshua tells a parable that can really give us insight into how we do this. It's about wheat and weeds, and I'm sure almost everybody watching tonight and kind of interacting about this, if you can give me a thumbs up, like, I get it, I know, I see it, because we already know how to relate to parables. So Matthew 13, and again, he's talking as he's using parables, he's using them to people, to the listeners, so that they will understand what he's saying. He's talking to an agricultural society. So this is who he's speaking this to. So in Matthew 13, 24 through 30, it says this. I'm going to read this without a card because unfortunately this is a little too long. But if you have your devices, maybe you want to look this up with me. I use the complete Jewish version, but you can follow with any version you're using. Yeshua put before them, again, Matthew 13, 24 through 30. Another parable. The kingdom, here's what he says. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while people were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, then went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads of grain, the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where have the weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The servant asked him, Then do you want us to go and pull them up? But he said, No, because if you pull up the weeds, you might uproot some of the wheat at the same time. Let them both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers to collect the weeds first and tie them in bundles to be burned, but to gather the wheat into my barn. Yeshua later gives an explanation of what the wheat and weeds parable means. And that's found in Matthew 13, 36 through 40. And I'm going to show you that on this card. His Talmudim approached him and said, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. And he answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. As for the good seed, these are the people who belong to the kingdom. And the weeds are the people who belong to the evil one. The enemy who sows them is the adversary. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up in fire, so will it be at the end of the age. And so here we see a really phenomenal parable that gives us everything we need to know about how to be in a position where there are enemies around us, but we are not at war. So again, Yeshua explains it. The wheat are those who belong to the kingdom. Of course, we know this is not referencing some sort of religious belief system, right? What makes us good seed and part of the kingdom is the word that is sown in us. We hear it and we do it. And y'all know the word for that, right? That's Shema. We hear the Hebrew word. We hear and we do. And if that's who we are, then we're part of the kingdom. Jim says, the main issue I have with this parable is that it does not account for people's free will. It automatically divides people into one of two categories without allowing for change. Evelyn, wow. Yeah, Jim, yeah, that's a really good point, because what you're questioning is if weeds can become wheat. And yes, they can. Absolutely, they can. And sometimes wheat can become weeds too, right? Yes, they can. But with the simplicity, hey, Lindsay, great to see you, honey. Shabbat Shalom. With the simplicity of parable teaching, the parable teaching is only ever really deals with one issue. So it's not complex. It's very simple. And people kind of get into trouble when they try to look at it, but what about this? Because it won't hold up under that. It's just only dealing with one simple issue. That's what a parable does. And this is dealing with the fact that there were, well, let's break it down to all the players. The wheat are those who belong to the kingdom. Again, these are the people that Shema hear and do. The wheat coexist, and it must share the supply with the weeds, okay? The nutrients in the ground it shares, the rain it shares, but the wheat doesn't war. The reapers don't pull them out. The people that work for the farmer, they don't pull them out. The wheat just does its thing. It grows, and it gets more effective with the challenge. Now, there is a protagonist in this story, and Jim, here's the real drop on this. The protagonist is the evil one. He was the one who planted the weeds. He sows too. He's always busy sowing. He's the real problem here. The weeds aren't even the real problem here. They are the fruits of the evil one's work. Evil did what evil does. He tried to destroy the wheat through planting seed that will be a growth distraction. And this is really what weeds are. They're distractions. They're not the evil. The evil one is the evil. He was the one who sowed them. Are you with me? So again, these are distracting things, the weeds, demanding our time, our energy, our focus. Weeds are the fruits of evil. Sometimes weeds don't even know they're weeds. They can think of themselves as wheat. The one that planted them is the real enemy, the devil. The weeds are simply a nuisance, okay? So, are you with me on that? Does that make sense? Obedience, Evelyn is saying. Yes, absolutely. Does that make sense? If you're good on that, give me a thumbs up, because it's important to connect with what this is. So how would this parable hit the people that Yeshua was teaching it to, the listeners? Again, they're agricultural people. The plant itself is called a zizania, and it translates zonin in Hebrew. And it's very well known and referenced in rabbinic literature. The zonin, or the weed, is a degenerative form of wheat. Now track with me on this because this is really, really cool. The zonin, the weed is a degenerate form of wheat. In Genesis Rabbah, which is an ancient midrash on the book of Genesis, this pseudo wheat is described as a type of prostituted wheat, meaning if there's a bit of sexual perversion here in it. The root word is zanut, and it means harlotry. Okay? So weeds are a perversion in the procreation. So as in the act of procreation, of multiplying, there was a perversion there that made a weed. And this pseudo wheat is really well known and considered a great nuisance by the farmers who were listening to Yeshua tell this parable. Sometimes adversaries would actually do this to destroy a competitor. Jesus is using a known criminal act in this parable, and the audience would have been enraged. He did this all the time, right? Like he did with the Good Samaritan. He loves to do this. The audience would want a war with the weeds and a war with the sower of the weeds. And common to the Jewish followers of Torah, they would try to build fences all around for a separation for the purpose of protection. Separation from the wicked was a common practice. But Yeshua here defies the farmer's logic of pulling up the weeds or separating them, and says premature weeding will destroy the wheat. Now, maybe the root system is intertwined. Maybe the weeds are actually making the wheat stronger. Maybe the weeds are similar to the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Whatever it is, there's something useful in the resistance. It's not a war. In other words, don't be distracted from being wheat, from growing. In some way, God wants to leave the weeds and still take care of your growth. Yeshua says, let them grow together, and at the harvest, they will be separated. The Matthean use of the words, the end of the age in this parable, is a Hebrew phrase which really means where evil will no longer triumph around us or in us. The wheat brings life, right? People take wheat and they make bread with it, which was life-sustaining in these days. It's God's garden. Sometimes I know we often ask, as the psalmist does in Psalm 94, how long, O Lord? How long shall the wicked prosper? But here we see this parable of Jesus. Yahweh will protect his wheat and grow his kingdom. The wheat will be rewarded and evil will be judged. So what's the alternative to war? You can choose to live among the weeds and bring love and life to the world through simply being who you are designed to be. Now, again, that doesn't mean middle ground, compromise. We still bring goodness in the world. We don't let lies and hate stand in our presence. We do the work of justice. We do the work of tikkun olam, which is the restoration of all things. We function as we're designed to be, and no enemy can stop that. And that is not a war. Evelyn says, hallelujah. Is the planter and the weed like you will reap like what you sow? Could be, Evelyn. Sure, could be. Yes, as a matter of fact. And one day the planter will reap what he's going to sow. Absolutely. Premature wedding night might also spread more weeds. Yes. Yes, good point, Alexander. Yep. Let me see if I missed any. Aaron, it's hard when the weeds are trying to smother us. Yes, Aaron, it is. Let me read Jim's, and then I'm going to do that. I'm getting parallels to the senator flying to Cancun and AOC deciding to raise money. Absolutely. When they slammed her, right? Great example, Jim. Here they are perverting the facts of why this even happened and blaming it on green power and all that lies and disinformation does, and blaming her specifically. And what does she do? She raises money for the people. Awesome. That's a perfect example. Aaron is like, it's hard when weeds are trying. Hey, Chris, good to see you, honey. Shabbat shalom. When it's hard when weeds are trying to smother us. Yes, that's where we really need. So here's what I'm throwing out at you tonight. If we're focused on growing when things are trying to smother us, if we're focused on growing, and again, there's a time for war, clearly, I qualify that. But if you feel like it's not your time for war, because none of us can live in this chronic state of war, as we clearly talk through, then, and you're focusing on growing and not fighting the weeds, that's a lot of energy for a life. And then the point is, with this parable that Jesus shared, is that the weeds can't smother the wheat. They can't. It's impossible, because he is the tender of the garden. Okay? He is the farmer, the overseer of the garden. So that's kind of our promise and our encouragement. And even when we feel like, wow, this is really a tension here, we have a promise that we can grow. We can live. So when we do this, when we grow instead of warring, we bring life without a war. And so to me, that gives me a lot of hope. So Shabbat Shalom. And the growing is a type of fighting. It's passive fighting. Yes, it is. That's exactly right, Jim. Yep, absolutely. So Shabbat Shalom. I love you all. We're in this together. We learn, we grow, we follow the journey as the shepherd leads, and hopefully we'll all be in that place of shalom, of peace, of wholeness, of health. I will see you next week. If you have any other thoughts, please comment. God bless.